Here is an orange ink by Sailor, Studio 873. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink. The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook. It's a fairly red-leaning ink, but definitely an orange, so consistent with no real color variation by pen. The shading, yes, it shades. The shading is frequent and really unexpected as a red or orange ink. They don't often shade a whole bunch, so there isn't much to say that isn't great about this ink from Sailor, which isn't a surprise that Sailor put out a great ink. The pen for today is a Levenger True Writer. All of the writing samples are done with a Retro 51 P51 with an extra fine nib, a Retro 51 Corsair with a medium nib, a Retro 51 Lincoln with a 1.1 stub. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there, starting with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the extra fine nib, we get a great orange with red in the shading, so spoiler there. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We do get some shading, some nice orange tones with a slight red lean. Becomes much more red at its darker areas. Take a look at the on the second line. Very dark, definitely red, where floor, the F, on the bottom is dark and red, but the top is kind of orangey, where and right next to that goes from lighter to darker or orange to red. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, with no feathering, with no spread, with shading. Now the shading is here and definitely shows. You see it more in how the tone changes, not that it gets so much darker. Take a look at small on the second line. It starts a lighter, works its way darker as it goes really orange to red. Same with the underneath it, slope right next to that, very nice and red, where run underneath, nice and orange, solid tone. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium and the extra fine, with no feathering, with no spread, with shading, showing off the way you really hope to see a stub nib do it. Really, the downstrokes tend to be a bit darker, showing more of the red, and the cross strokes lighter with more of the orange, giving like struck on the first line, lighter and darker tones in and out of your writing, doing a great job. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting. Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Looking at the extra fine nib, it is a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. Slightly more red leaning as well, with no feathering, with no spread, with no shading onto this paper. It's performing very well, even though it's not shading. Typically, you don't expect that shade from any kind of orange or red, so when it's there, it's nice. The fact that it's not here doesn't make me feel like I'm missing out, because it does look great on the page. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, same tone as the Clairfontaine, with no feathering, with no spread, with shading coming through that wasn't there so much in the extra fine. You really see it in himself on the first line, which pick next to it was much darker, but then it lightens up in himself. It starts as a darker tone, works its way lighter in the middle of the word, and then the LF at the end, much darker again. Sword on the second line, light to very dark on the D. really shading so well. Such a surprise here. It was really just a blessing. Looking at the stub nib, it is a tad bit darker than it was on the medium nib. A little surprise there, a little bit darker than on the Clairfontaine. No feathering, no spread, still shading very well. With it being a bit darker, more of the shade shows in areas that it's getting lighter, like whispering on the first line, where the W and the S are a bit lighter than the rest of the word, but even the R right in the middle lightens up, really draws your attention straight to that word, which you'll see is over where I made a mistake and scratched the letter out. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and can easily, and no ghosting, easily able to write back here without really destroying anything. Such a good paper.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting it into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is a bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does look red and not orange, and none of it is really going to come through as an orange. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it still does offer some shading, but it's going from a lighter red to a darker red as a result of the tone of the paper. Not a bad thing, it's just a thing to be expecting when you're dealing with tone paper in how it can really affect it. I would expect to see very much the same thing happen on the yellow Rhodia at the end of the video. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine. Just as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine. So pretty nice. Still certainly red. Not seeing any kind of orange going on here. No feathering, no spreading. Yes, it is shading. You see it in again on the second line. He underneath it is much darker. Followed right next to that, starts darker, lightens up in the middle, gets much darker at the end, where nothing on the fourth line starts light, works its way dark, but all of it is red. None of it is orange, so just be prepared. Looking at the stub nib, it is a tad bit darker than it was with the medium, bit darker than on the Clairfontaine. Definitely a red and not an orange, as it has been on this paper. With no feathering, with no spread, with shading, without a doubt. Look at crawling on that first line. Starts dark, lightens up at the end, but the ling at the end, much darker. Golem underneath that is got a darker G. The O is a bit lighter. The L's darken up, and the apostrophe S at the end, quite a bit lighter. So still shading very well as a red on this paper. Looking at the back of the page, we can easily write back here. There's really no ghosting. Nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left. Pen flush is on the top right. 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Trying to make that argument that they're the same paper, though I'm going to hold that they're not. It has no feathering. It has no spread. It shades just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. We definitely get an orange. The darker spots in the shading show up as a red. It really is it's an energetic color to look at. You can't help but feel a bit nicer with it. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine, same tone as the Clairfontaine. There is no feathering, there is no spread. There is some shading, though I think the shading here shows a bit better, so I called them the same tone. The Clairfontaine tended to show more of the darker tones, where here we're seeing more of the lighter tones, but we're getting all of those same tones. Look at pockets on the second line. Some nice dark to start, lightens up, gets a bit darker at the K, lightens at the E, darker at the T, lightens up again, very dark at the last S, where precious starts dark, works its way light, and works its way dark again. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. We get no feathering, we get no spread. We do get some shading. I don't think the shading is standing out as well here as it did on the Clairfontaine. It is still doing very well. Look at birthday on the first line, starting darker, lightening up, getting very dark at the H, lightening up again, and much darker again at the Y, where pricked starts as a darker midtone, gets light, very dark at the K, light at the beginning of the D, dark at the end of the D. Looking at the back of the page, as you would expect, there is no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Caran d'Ache Electric Orange. Here is Mont Blanc Gandhi. Here is Pilot Mixable Orange. Here is Zenzoi Juicy Orange. The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it's about as dark as it was on the Clairfontaine, yet it is showing much more orange than it did on the Clairfontaine. Really making sure you know this is orange and not an orange leaning red. No feather, no spread, only a few spots of shading that are going on. You see it in he and dared on the first line, still on the second, back on the third. But on the fourth line, you see a very consistent orange most of the way through. So the shading can be kind of hit or miss. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as it was with the extra fine. Flatter as a tone from what we're seeing on the Clairfontaine, if I didn't mention that there, but it is certainly a flatter tone. Still very flattering to look at, with no feathering, with no spread. Here we get almost nothing for shading. Really only a couple spots, the H of birthday or could on the first line, but for the most part, we get a fairly consistent orange all the way through. And if you were a student in a lab and you use this with such a great tone, I'll go ahead and I'll bump you an entire letter just for choosing a great ink. Looking at the stub nib, it is the same tone as the medium. Same as the Clairfontaine, yet again, still just a bit flatter, with no feathering, with no spread. Yes, it does shade. Considering that the medium didn't, it's kind of nice that it's here. Now the shading is not as pronounced as it was on the Clairfontaine, but it's definitely there. Look at way. The W starts lighter and the end of the W is darker. The A starts a bit darker and lightens up on its way into the Y, and then the Y gets darker at the end of it, where last starts light and ends on the last letter with a darker tone. Nasty, you nasty little word on the second line. Starts light and ends dark at the TY, because you're just so nasty. Looking at the back of the page, there is no bleed, no ghost. Great for students.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a blue ink by Birmingham Pen Company, USS Requiem Navy Blue. Here is a brown ink by Delta Brown. Here is a green ink by Pelican 4001 Brilliant Green. Here is a purple ink by Noodler's Purple Martin. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the extra fine nib, it is a bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather, it does spread. I think it takes away from this ink quite a bit. Some of the feathering spots really do draw your attention to them for really not being good. That being said, with the feather and the spread that's there, is it horrible? No, the spread's not horrible. The feathering is a little distracting to me, though. So maybe if this was a bit drier as a pen, this would have been a better match. Shading, not really. There's none here, and it's really coming across as an orange. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the extra fine. Definitely an orange, not a red leaning orange. It does feather more than the extra fine did. It does spread, I think, a little bit more than the extra fine had spread. It really is distracting. Look at, on the second line, flattened himself. Horrible. I'm drawn to how horrible it looks with its feathering and its spreading. Now, there's no shading going on. I suppose you could really use this if you wanted to. I would not want to use this on this paper. If you did that in my class, I'll mark you down a letter. Looking at the stub nib, we get the same tone as we did with the medium. It feathers a lot. It spreads a lot. Does it look good? He said, no. He answered, it looks like garbage. But it is copy paper, so yes, it is making marks and putting down what it is you'd want to put down. It's putting down the quality of this ink. The ink is much better than what we get to see here. It's not shading, thankfully, so hopefully it doesn't bleed through, and hopefully we never put this ink on this paper again. Looking at the back of the page, you see there's plenty of ghosting, so you wouldn't want to write back here, but nothing bled through, touching the page underneath, leaving that page to go ahead and ruin another fountain pen ink.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink? The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
This ink is so straightforward and consistent. There's no choice other than to call it a dealer's choice. So get your favorite fountain pen ink. Use this ink, enjoy the hell out of it. Unless you're using copy paper, then use something else, because you're going to really miss out on all of the best things this ink has to offer.
I hope you got something out of this video, and I want to remind you that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you've heard of something if you were to go to buy.